When my brother's lawyer stood up in court and called me unstable, I thought I had already heard the worst of it. But then Gordon looked me straight in the eye, smirked, and told the judge I wasn't fit to carry our father's name. That single word, unfit, cut deeper than any wound I ever carried. And in that moment, I realized my own family hadn't just turned against me. They wanted to erase me. My name is Mildred Whitfield, and this is the story of how I refused to be erased. The county courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old varnish, the kind of place where whispers carried farther than they should. Rows of wooden benches were packed with neighbors who had nothing better to do than witness my family unravel. Their eyes followed me as I walked the aisle, every step measured, every heartbeat echoing louder than I wanted. I refused to bow my head, even as the weight of their judgment pressed down from every side. Across the room, Gordon leaned toward Clarissa, his mouth curling into a grin that wasn't meant for anyone else but me. She adjusted the strand of pearls around her neck and gave him a nod, as if the outcome had already been decided. They looked polished, confident, the picture of control, while I was cast as the problem they came to solve. The clerk's monotone voice filled the air, reciting the case number, reducing years of family history to a string of syllables. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the scrape of benches filled the silence. The door at the side opened, and Judge Marcus Ellison entered, his robe crisp, expression unreadable. He moved toward the bench with the practiced neutrality of a man who had seen it all before, until his eyes met mine. His step faltered. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. He whispered it, low but clear enough to cut through the quiet. "My God, it's her!" The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was immediate. Papers stilled, heads turned. Gordon's smirk faltered, and Clarissa's hand froze on her pearls. No one else understood what those words meant, but I did. And the shift in that instant told me nothing about this fight would be as simple as they had planned. The Whitfield farm stretched across the valley like a memory that refused to fade. Rolling hills brushed with red maples framed the fields. But beneath that beauty ran a current of tension I could never ignore. As a girl, I had carried feed buckets and fixed fences while my father's voice urged me to stand tall. To shoulder weight others couldn't. Gordon was never asked to do the same. He was shielded, excused, called fragile, when the truth was he simply avoided responsibility. That imbalance never left him. It only festered. When Clarissa entered his life, she saw the farm through different eyes. To her, it wasn't soil and sweat and history. It was potential profit. She smiled as though she belonged, but every look she cast across the land measured it in dollars, not roots. From the beginning, I could feel her staking a claim with a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with family. The day I found the appraiser in the yard, clipboard in hand, running his tape along the porch posts, it hit like a slap. Gordon stood behind him, arms crossed, surveying the place as if it were already his to sell. I walked closer, my boots crunching on gravel, and asked what was going on. He didn't flinch. His eyes were cold when he said, "You're only making this harder. This is reality. Stop fighting it." The words landed heavier than any insult. To him, I was no longer family, just an obstacle in the way of his next scheme. Rain hammered the windows that night, wind rattling the old shutters as I searched my father's study. Dust clung to every surface, but the desk drawer gave way, with a groan I hadn't heard in years. My fingers brushed something hidden beneath false wood, a small, worn box. The key slipped out from a copy of Walden, tucked exactly where my father knew I'd look if I ever needed strength. Inside, time folded in on itself. Legal papers thick with clauses and seals, an ironclad trust locking the farm beyond the reach of anyone but me. And beneath them, a letter in his hand, the lines uneven but strong. "If the day comes when they turn against you, hold the line. This land is not just ours. It is yours to guard. This is your burden and your shield." I sat there with the paper trembling in my hands, the storm howling outside, realizing my father had seen this battle long before it began. He had left me not only a weapon of law, but a reminder that I was never meant to surrender. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cedar and old spices, the table scarred with years of meals and memories. It was where my mother once set down bowls of stew and corrected my posture as I learned to slice bread. That afternoon, Gordon and Clarissa walked in as though it already belonged to them, carrying a stack of documents that slapped against the wood like a challenge. Clarissa's voice was sharp, the pearls at her throat gleaming as she leaned forward. "This farm could bring in millions. You're wasting it by clinging to the past." Her tone cut like glass, dismissing every memory soaked into these walls. I steadied my hand on the table, feeling its grooves under my palm. "It isn't wasted. It's rooted. What you're chasing isn't land. It's the legacy our parents left, and you want to strip it clean." Gordon shoved the papers across the table, the weight of the signatures and seals sliding toward me. "Sign it! Transfer everything! End this fight!" His voice carried the smug certainty of someone convinced he had cornered me. I pushed the folder back. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the tick of the old kitchen clock. His mouth twisted into a smirk. "If you won't, I'll prove you're unfit. Everyone knows about the file, the stress, the episodes after your cases. That's enough to bury you." The words struck harder than the contract. They weren't just trying to take the farm. They were ready to smear the darkest chapters of my life. This wasn't family anymore. It was open war. Morning in the village was usually slow, but that day the cafe buzzed with gossip. Every table lined with the same headline: "Ex-federal agent unfit to manage family farm." The article spilled rumor after rumor, claims that I was forgetful, prone to breakdowns, dangerous with responsibility. When I walked to the market, neighbors shifted away, eyes sliding past me. Old friends who once waved now looked down at their bags. Behind me, a woman whispered, just loud enough, "She's not the same anymore. Something's wrong with her." Each word was another stone thrown. By nightfall, I couldn't ignore the pattern. Gordon and Clarissa hadn't just brought this fight into court, they'd dragged it into the street, feeding the town lies until they spread like wildfire. I called an old colleague, a man who had once stood at my side on raids and now wore a lawyer's suit instead of a badge. He studied the documents Gordon intended to submit, and his brow darkened. Signatures wavered, dates didn't match, and the inconsistencies stacked up. He set the file down with finality, looking me dead in the eye. "Mildred, this isn't just family squabbling. This is fraud. If we strike in the right place, Gordon won't just lose the case. He'll collapse." For the first time, I felt the shift inside me. They thought they'd painted me into a corner, but now I had something they hadn't planned for, a way to fight back with proof sharper than their lies. The next hearing drew an even larger crowd. The benches filled shoulder to shoulder, cameras clustered like vultures in the back. The stories printed in bold headlines had already turned the town into a jury of whispers. When Gordon's attorney rose, his voice carried the false weight of authority as he held up a folder. He announced it was my medical history, proof, he claimed, that I had once been treated for psychiatric instability and violent outbursts. Gordon clasped his hands together, his face arranged into a mask of worry. "I only want my sister to be safe," he told the judge with an almost tender sigh. "And I want our father's estate to be protected from her poor judgment." His performance was polished, but the words dripped poison. I kept my spine straight, my eyes steady. I asked for an independent review of the documents. The judge nodded, and the folder was passed to the examiner. The silence was suffocating while he flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each turn. Finally, he cleared his throat. The font didn't match hospital records. The ink had aged incorrectly. The notary seal belonged to an office that hadn't even existed the year the document was supposedly signed. Murmurs rippled through the room, heads turning toward Gordon and Clarissa. The foundation beneath their smug certainty shifted. By evening, Local papers no longer ran with the story of my supposed breakdown. Instead, they asked whether Gordon had presented fraudulent evidence. Suspicion now clung to him, not me. For the first time, the tide of judgment began to turn, and I felt the current shifting in my favor. The break between sessions was chaos, reporters swarming, flashbulbs popping, questions hurled like stones. Through it all, Judge Ellison's gaze kept finding me. It wasn't casual, it was searching, remembering. His eyes held a weight I hadn't seen in decades. The memories rose unbidden. A winter night in New Hampshire, the abandoned house where a desperate man held a young prosecutor at gunpoint. I had kicked down the door, gunfire splitting the air, and dragged that man out bleeding but alive. That man had been Marcus Ellison, trembling but alive because I had refused to leave him behind. When court resumed, my lawyer walked calmly to the evidence table and placed a photograph for the record. There it was, frozen in time. Me in body armor, blood staining my sleeve, hauling a younger Ellison out of the wreckage. Gasps spread through the gallery. Gordon's face drained of color. Clarissa sat rigid, eyes wide. Reporters scribbled furiously. Former federal agent once saved current judge? The room vibrated with the revelation. Ellison removed his glasses slowly, setting them down. He didn't speak a word at first. He just looked at me, long and unwavering, then nodded once, deliberate, undeniable. The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. Past and present collided in that instant. This was no longer only about a farm. It was about truth, sacrifice, and justice that refused to stay buried. The family feud had been recast into something larger, a story of survival and a reckoning long overdue. The final hearing had the air of a spectacle. Every bench was filled, townspeople shoulder to shoulder, with reporters clutching their notepads, cameras poised. The air was thick with anticipation, so tense that the faint scratch of a pen echoed like thunder. I sat rigid at my table, feeling every eye burn into me, yet refusing to bend beneath the weight of their gaze. Then Gordon erupted. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he leapt to his feet, voice cracking with rage. "She's delusional!" he shouted, pointing across the courtroom. "She belongs in a psychiatric ward, not in control of this farm." His words hung sharp and ugly, slicing through the hush. Murmurs spread instantly, people craning their necks, eager for blood. Beside him, Clarissa stared down at the table. Her knuckles were white around her pearls, twisting them tighter and tighter, as though she could squeeze courage from the strand. She didn't meet a single gaze. Shame wrapped around her shoulders like a shroud. My attorney rose without a word, crossing to the evidence table. From a slim folder, he drew a photograph and held it aloft. Gasps swept the room as the image was displayed. Me, younger, armored vest torn and blood seeping through the fabric, dragging a terrified young prosecutor out of a hostage scene. The grainy shot captured not only the danger, but the defiance in my eyes. The room fell into a stunned silence. People whispered, names carried from one bench to another until the weight of recognition sank in. My attorney's voice cut clean. The man in that photograph, the life saved that day, sits on this very bench. All eyes turned. Judge Marcus Ellison removed his glasses, his expression no longer hidden behind formality. He rose to his feet, his voice ringing with a steadiness that silenced even the reporter's furious pens. "If it weren't for Mrs. Whitfield, I would not be alive today. And I know better than anyone here the character of the woman you're trying to discredit." The gallery erupted, a swell of gasps and shouts, cameras flashing like lightning. Gordon stumbled back into his seat, face drained of color. Clarissa's eyes brimmed with tears, a single drop slipping down her cheek. In that instant, the tide that had threatened to drown me broke and turned. The power they wielded with lies was gone. The truth had cut straight through their theater, and the entire courtroom felt it shift beneath their feet. The next hearing was unlike the others. It no longer felt like a family dispute whispered behind closed doors. It was a public reckoning. The press had crammed into every space the bailiff would allow. Cameras and recorders pointed squarely at us, ready to capture the unraveling of a lie that had grown too large to contain. Every seat was filled, every head craned forward. You could feel the collective breath being held. My attorney began methodically, his voice calm but unrelenting as he laid one document after another before the court. First came the property transfers Gordon had waved like banners of inevitability, side by side with authentic records. Their flaws screamed out, signatures jagged and mismatched, notaries non-existent, dates that betrayed their own fiction. Then came the supposed medical reports, the ones that painted me as unstable. Experts testified that the fonts weren't even used by the VA at the time. Seals belonged to offices that hadn't yet opened. The pile of deceit grew taller with every exhibit. Across the aisle, Gordon's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. His rehearsed confidence collapsed as he stumbled through objections, each one overruled. When pressed directly, he dodged questions, muttered half-answers, his voice thinning under the weight of facts. The courtroom could smell desperation, and it fed on it. Then came the moment no one expected. Clarissa, who had sat frozen through most of the trial, suddenly pushed back her chair. The scrape of wood against tile cut through the silence. She rose slowly, her hands trembling, voice catching in her throat. "He made me sign papers I never read," she confessed, her words breaking like glass. "I let myself believe it was business. I was wrong to trust him." The gallery gasped. Gordon snapped his head toward her, eyes blazing, but she didn't falter. She turned fully toward the bench, her shoulders stiff with a courage born too late. "There were lies," she admitted, tears shining under the harsh lights. "Lies I went along with. I can't stand here and let them continue." The shift was seismic. In an instant, Gordon's carefully built narrative collapsed, not from outside attack, but from the betrayal of the person he counted on most. He slammed his fist against the table, snarling, "You don't know what you're saying!" But his words rang hollow, an echo of a man who had already lost. The judge's gavel cut through the chaos, his face grim. The ruling was swift, unshakable. The trust was valid. The property and estate belonged solely to me, and every attempt to undermine it was fraudulent. Gordon now faced not just civil defeat, but the shadow of criminal charges. Fraud, forgery, perjury, all circling him like vultures. The noise of the gallery swelled, some in shock, others in satisfaction. The reporters scribbled furiously, knowing tomorrow's headlines would no longer question me, but would brand Gordon with disgrace. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened. The weight that had been pressed on me was finally shifting off my shoulders. I didn't look at Gordon as the ruling was read. I didn't need to. His silence told me everything. He had lost more than a case. He had lost the weapon of fear he had wielded so long. I lifted my eyes to the bench, and in that moment, it was clear. Justice had finally spoken, and for once, the truth was louder than their lies. Months later, the farm no longer looked like the battlefield it once had. Fresh paint covered the old clapboards, and a new sign swung proudly at the entrance. Whitfield Resilience Center. Carved beneath it were the words my father once wrote to me. Hold the line. For the first time in years, the phrase felt less like a burden and more like a promise. On opening day, the yard was filled with neighbors, veterans, retired officers, and reporters capturing the moment. The sound of laughter replaced the whispers that once trailed me through town. I stood before the crowd, speaking not of loss, but of healing, of creating a place where those scarred by service could find solid ground again. Toward the back, Judge Ellison stood quietly, his hands clasped. A faint nod offered when our eyes met. It was enough. A silent recognition that our paths had intertwined for reasons larger than either of us. As the speeches ended, a figure approached hesitantly. Clarissa, stripped of her pearls and painted smile, clutched a small wooden box to her chest. Her voice trembled as she held it out. I lost myself in all of this, but this, it belongs with you. Inside lay my father's pocket watch, its face worn smooth from his hands. The weight of it in my palm was heavier than gold. I looked up at the photograph of my father hanging in the hall and whispered, so only I could hear. I held the line. Dad. The fight had begun with betrayal and vengeance, but it ended here, with justice, with renewal, and with a legacy remade for something greater than myself.